She thought it was just another job, a way to keep herself busy, to put food on her own table, and maybe find a little peace in a life that hadn't been easy. When she answered the call to cook for a group of cowboys working on a ranch, she never imagined the path it would lead her down. To her, it sounded simple enough. Rise before dawn, prepare hearty meals, and make sure the men had something warm in their stomachs before heading out into the fields. Hard work, yes, but nothing she couldn't handle. She had seen worse, much worse. The ranch stretched wide under the open sky, miles of rolling land that seemed to go on forever. When she first arrived, the air felt sharp, filled with the smell of dust, wood, and horses. Cowboys came and went, boots scraping against the wooden porch, voices carrying across the yard. She was the newcomer, the outsider stepping into a world she didn't yet understand. But all she wanted was a chance to work honestly, to prove herself without asking anyone for pity. Her hands moved fast in the kitchen, chopping, stirring, kneading, always on her feet. The sound of sizzling pans mixed with laughter from the men who waited at the long wooden table. They teased, they joked, but they never went hungry. Slowly, without meaning to, she became part of their rhythm. Meals weren't just food, they were fuel, a piece of comfort after long hours under the sun. But there was something she didn't know. Among the men she fed each day, one of them wasn't like the others. He wore the same worn boots, carried the same dust on his shoulders, and sat quietly at the same table. To her, he was just another cowboy, another ranch hand who tipped his hat in thanks and went back to work. She had no idea the truth he carried, or the secret that made him different from all the rest. What began as a job to earn her living was about to turn into something much more. The land beneath her feet held stories she couldn't yet see, and the man she thought she barely noticed would soon stand at the center of them all. Before she ever set foot on the ranch, her life had been marked by hardship. Work was scarce, and every dollar stretched thin. She had known hunger more than once, not the kind that comes from skipping a single meal, but the kind that lingers for days, making bones ache and thoughts heavy. Her hands had grown rough from whatever work she could find, washing, mending, scrubbing floors for people who barely noticed her presence. Yet she carried on because stopping was never an option. When she heard about the cooking job, it seemed like both a chance and a risk. Ranch life was not for the faint of heart, and feeding a crew of men was no small task. But she had grit. She had been raised to rise early, to put in the effort even when her body longed for rest. Cooking wasn't foreign to her. It was something she knew well, something that reminded her of the few good memories from her past. So when the offer came, she did not hesitate. She packed what little she owned and left behind the quiet town that had offered her little more than judgment. The journey to the ranch was long, a dusty trail that wound through fields and broken fences. She arrived at dawn, the sky still streaked with shades of gray and blue. The ranch looked endless, with land stretching as far as her eyes could see. Horses snorted from the corral, their breath rising like smoke in the morning chill. The main house stood sturdy, its wooden frame worn but strong, with a smaller building nearby that she quickly learned was the bunkhouse. That was where the cowboys lived, men who worked from first light until the stars came out. She stepped into the kitchen, and for a moment doubt struck her. The stove was old, iron blackened with years of use. Pots and pans hung from hooks, dented and scarred but still serviceable. The shelves held sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat. It was not much, but it was enough. She tied her apron and got to work. The first morning she built the fire high, the crackle of wood echoing through the stillness. She kneaded dough until her arms ached, stirred pots until steam clouded her face, and fried bacon until the smell filled every corner of the house. By the time the cowboys filed in, their boots thudding against the floor, the table was set with biscuits, beans, eggs, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They ate in silence at first, glancing her way with quick, measuring looks. Some nodded in approval, others simply kept their eyes on their plates. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to impress them with words. Her work would speak louder. By the end of the meal, every plate was clean, every cup drained. The men rose, tipping hats in quiet thanks before heading out to the day's labor. Day after day, the pattern repeated. She rose before dawn, worked until her back ached, and fed the men with whatever the ranch stores allowed. Sometimes it was hearty meals of beef and potatoes. Other times it was simple stews, stretched thin but flavored with care. The cowboys began to talk more around her, sharing laughter, trading stories about cattle drives and wild nights in town. She didn't join in much, but she listened. Their stories painted pictures of a life rougher and freer than she had ever known. Still, her mind often returned to her own reasons for being there. She hadn't just taken the job for survival. She needed to prove to herself that she was more than the struggles she had endured, that she could build something honest with her own hands. Each loaf of bread, each pot of stew, each cup of coffee became more than food. It became proof of her resilience. Yet even as she settled into her role, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. Ranch life was demanding, and the men around her were strangers. She wondered how long they would tolerate her presence, whether they would grow tired of her food or her silence. She carried the weight of her past with her, the memories of people who had cast her aside, who had told her she wasn't enough. It was hard to believe this place would be different, but slowly, signs began to appear. A cowboy leaving an extra portion of flour by the kitchen door. Another fixing a broken step on the porch without being asked. One of the younger men tipping his hat each morning with a shy smile. They were small gestures, but they meant something. They told her she was not invisible here. Through it all, she noticed one man who stood apart from the others. He wasn't louder, nor did he try to draw attention to himself. He worked with the crew, ate at the same table, wore the same dust-stained clothes. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a steadiness that made him different. He never rushed his words, never wasted them. He watched more than he spoke, and though his eyes rarely lingered on her, she felt the weight of his presence. To her, he was just another cowboy, another man shaped by the land. She never guessed that behind his quiet nature lay a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about the ranch. For now, she focused on her work, unaware that each meal she served, each day she endured, was drawing her closer to a truth hidden in plain sight. The days on the ranch fell into a steady rhythm, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. She was up before the first rooster crowed, the kitchen already warm with fire by the time the cowboys stumbled in rubbing sleep from their eyes. Her hands worked fast, shaping dough, slicing onions, stirring pots until steam filled the air. She found a strange comfort in the routine. It gave her purpose, and it kept her from dwelling on the past. Every meal placed on the table was another way of proving to herself, most of all, that she could stand on her own 2 feet. The cowboys grew used to her presence quickly. At first they were cautious, curious about the woman who had suddenly become part of their world. But hunger softened judgment, and the smell of her cooking carried more weight than any introduction. Soon they came to rely on her the way they relied on their saddles and spurs. When the work was long and the nights cold, her food gave them strength. They teased her sometimes, tossing light-hearted jokes across the table, but never cruelly. She wasn't one of them, but she wasn't an outsider anymore either. She noticed their habits. The youngest cowboy always asked for seconds, his appetite bottomless. Another never spoke much, but he always set his cup back near the stove for more coffee without asking. Small things told her who they were, and in return, she found herself remembered in ways she hadn't expected. A sack of fresh apples left on the counter, a jar of honey placed by the stove, repairs made quietly around the kitchen without her needing to ask. Little signs of respect that slowly chipped away at her doubts. But among all of them, there was one who remained the hardest to read. He sat at the table like the rest, spoke when needed, laughed occasionally at a joke, but there was something different about him. He was watchful, steady in a way the others weren't. While the younger men were quick to fill silence with chatter, he seemed content to let silence breathe. His hands were strong and sure, his voice calm, his words chosen with care. She couldn't decide whether he carried more weight on his shoulders or simply chose to bear it differently. He never treated her unkindly. If anything, he treated her like he did everyone else, without fuss, without judgment. But she felt a pull toward his quiet nature, though she didn't understand why. He would offer to carry heavy sacks into the kitchen, his movements efficient and without complaint. He would nod his thanks after meals, not dramatically, just enough to show he noticed the effort. And when the work outside grew tense, when tempers flared among the men, his voice was the one that cut through, calm and steady enough to settle the storm. To her, he seemed like a cowboy who had simply been shaped by the land. She had no reason to think otherwise. His boots were as worn as the rest, his shirt patched, his hands calloused from work. If there was a secret about him, it was buried deep, and he showed no sign of revealing it. As the weeks passed, she learned how harsh ranch life could be. Storms rolled across the plains without warning, tearing at fences and scattering cattle. Days of hard rain left mud so thick it swallowed boots. The sun, when it came back, burned until skin blistered. The cowboys worked through it all, their bodies pushed to exhaustion, and she worked beside them in her own way, feeding them, keeping them steady with hot meals waiting no matter how rough the day had been. It was during one of these storms that she saw the quiet cowboy in a different light. The winds had been howling all day, rattling the windows of the kitchen while she tried to keep the fire alive. The cowboys came in drenched, mud dripping from their clothes, their faces lined with fatigue. She set food before them and they ate in silence, the storm outside louder than their voices. But when she looked up, she caught his eyes, just for a moment before he looked away. There was something in them she couldn't name, something steady, but also protective, as though he carried not just his own weight, but something more. That night, as the wind screamed through the trees, she lay awake on her narrow cot, her mind circling back to that glance. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was only tired, her imagination running wild. Still, the thought lingered. Who was he really? Why did he seem different from the rest? The days after the storm tested everyone. Fences had to be repaired, cattle rounded up, supplies stretched thin. She cooked with whatever she had left, turning scraps into meals that warmed the men enough to keep them going. The cowboys grumbled about the work, but not him. He simply did what needed to be done, no complaint, no boasting. She watched him more closely then, drawn not by words, but by the quiet strength in how he carried himself. One evening, when the work was finally done and the men sat around the table, one of the cowboys teased her about burning the bread. Laughter filled the room, but he silenced it with a glance. Not harsh, not unkind, but firm enough to remind them of their manners. The teasing ended, and she felt a warmth stir in her chest she hadn't expected. For the first time in years, someone had stood for her, even in the smallest way. She thought about it long after the table had cleared, as she washed dishes by lamplight. She thought about how easy it was for men to laugh at her, how quickly people had dismissed her in the past. Yet here in this rough place, a man who said little had spoken on her behalf without a word. She didn't know his secret. She didn't know why he seemed different. To her, he was just another cowboy in worn boots and a dust-stained shirt. But something about him unsettled her heart in ways she couldn't yet explain. And soon enough, she would learn the truth, that he wasn't just a man among them, but the one who owned everything they stood on. The weeks stretched into months, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost unshakable. Morning came early, as always, with the sound of boots on wooden floors and the clatter of pans in the kitchen. The men ate fast, talking in low voices before scattering into the fields to work. She watched them ride out from the porch sometimes, horses kicking up dust against the rising sun, and wondered if this land would ever feel like hers too. She had grown stronger in those weeks. The fear she carried when she first arrived had faded into something steadier. Her hands were sure as she cooked, her voice firmer when she gave directions to the younger cowboys who came to help her haul water or split wood. She didn't feel invisible anymore. There were eyes that noticed her now, not just as the woman who filled their plates, but as someone who belonged to the life they were building out here. Among all of them, though, her thoughts returned often to the quiet one. He still didn't speak much, yet somehow his silence said more than the other's words. He carried himself differently, steady and calm even when the work was hardest. When tempers flared over cattle lost in a storm, he was the one who calmed the others with a simple word or look. When fences broke or supplies ran thin, he didn't complain. He just worked, as though nothing was too heavy for him to bear. She began to notice small details. He always made sure his horse was cared for before he sat down to eat. He never left the table until everyone else had their share. And sometimes, late at night, she'd glance out the cabin window and see him walking the edge of the property, as if making sure nothing threatened the place they all depended on. To her, he seemed almost like a guard more than just a hand. One evening, after a long day of work, she found herself outside by the well drawing water. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, the air cooling as the sun dipped low. She didn't hear him approach at first, but then he was there, steadying the heavy bucket before it slipped from her grasp. She looked up in surprise, words caught in her throat. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened in the fading light. "Careful," he said simply, and then he carried the water inside as though it weighed nothing. It was a small thing, yet it lingered with her long after. No one had looked out for her in such a way for years, not since before life had hardened around her. She tried to brush it off, to tell herself she was reading too much into it. But when she lay awake that night, listening to the sound of the wind outside, she couldn't shake the memory of his hand steadying hers. The truth about him was still hidden, and she had no reason to suspect it. He blended in too well, wore the same worn clothes, lived the same rough life as the others. To her, he was another cowboy among many, one who happened to carry himself with quiet strength. She didn't know yet that the land he worked, the cattle he rode out to protect, the house she cooked in, all of it was his. The turning point came one harsh week when a storm swept across the ranch. Rain poured in sheets, the river swelled, and the cattle scattered. The men worked day and night to keep the herd together, drenched to the bone, mud weighing down every step. Supplies dwindled, tempers rose, and exhaustion pushed them all to the edge. She did what she could, stretching food, boiling coffee, keeping the fire alive, but even she began to feel the strain. It was during that storm that she saw him most clearly. While others cursed and argued, he stayed calm. He directed the younger cowboys with steady orders, pulled more than his share of weight, and when one man nearly collapsed from exhaustion, he carried him back to the bunkhouse without a word. She watched through the rain-streaked window as he moved through the storm, unyielding, as though the land itself had shaped him for moments like this. When the skies finally cleared, the ranch was battered but standing. Fences were broken, supplies nearly gone, but the herd had been saved, and the men were still standing. That night, when they all gathered around the table, tired but alive, she placed food before them with trembling hands. The room was filled with silence, not from anger this time, but from weariness and relief. She glanced at him then, the quiet cowboy who had carried them all through the storm. His face was lined with exhaustion, mud still caked on his boots, but his eyes were steady as ever. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in years: trust. It unsettled her, this growing sense that he was more than what he seemed. She tried to push it aside, reminding herself that men often carried secrets. Still, she couldn't help but wonder. Why did he never boast, never complain, never falter? Why did it feel as though the weight of the ranch rested more on his shoulders than anyone else's? Her questions had no answers yet, but they grew louder in her mind with each passing day. And though she didn't know it, the truth was already moving closer. The truth that he wasn't just a cowboy, but the man who owned the land beneath their feet. The man who had chosen to stand among his own workers, watching quietly, waiting to see who they truly were when they thought no one important was watching. She didn't know that her strength, her resilience, and her quiet dignity had already caught his eye in ways she couldn't imagine. She didn't know how soon she would discover that everything she believed about him was only the beginning of the story. The storm had left its mark on the ranch. Fences were splintered, the barn roof leaked in places, and the men moved more slowly than before, their bodies aching from days without rest. She kept the kitchen fire burning brighter than usual, knowing the warmth was as important as the food itself. Each pot of stew, each fresh loaf of bread, was more than a meal. It was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, that strength came back one step at a time. She worked harder too, though her body protested. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her back sore from lifting heavy pots. But when she saw the cowboys dragging themselves to the table, their shoulders slumped, she found the energy to keep going. They had carried the ranch through the storm. The least she could do was make sure they had something hot waiting for them. It was in these days that she noticed the quiet cowboy more than ever. He was there at sunrise, already moving before the others, checking fences, counting cattle, repairing what the storm had broken. He asked for nothing, took no credit, but it was clear he carried more than his share of the work. She saw it in the way the younger men looked to him, waiting for direction without realizing it. She saw it in the way no one questioned his judgment. He wasn't just another hand. He was the one they followed, even if they didn't say it aloud. One afternoon, she stepped outside after the dishes were washed, the sound of hammering echoing from the far end of the corral. He was there, sleeves rolled up, driving nails into a broken rail. She hesitated, then picked up a handful of nails lying on the ground. Without a word, she held them out to him. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as though weighing whether to accept the help. Then he nodded, his hand brushing hers as he took them. That small touch sent a shiver through her, though she told herself it was only the chill of the wind. They worked in silence for a while. She handed him nails, held a board steady as he secured it. Her arms ached, but she refused to show it. When the fence was finally upright again, he stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sturdy," he said simply. She almost smiled at the way he spoke, short, certain, as if a single word could hold the weight of an entire sentence. That night, when the men gathered at the table, she noticed how the others leaned into his presence. He didn't demand it, but it was there all the same. Respect, unspoken but clear. And she began to wonder more deeply who he really was. No ordinary cowboy carried himself like that, with a steadiness that seemed rooted in the land itself. The truth began to press at the edges of her mind, though she still couldn't see it fully. She only knew that the ranch felt different when he was near, safer somehow, more certain. She found herself listening for the sound of his boots outside, catching herself glancing toward him more often than she meant to. And though she told herself it was nothing, she couldn't deny that something about him pulled at her, steady and quiet like the rhythm of the earth. One evening, a small group of riders came through, men from a neighboring ranch. They stopped by for supplies and stayed long enough to share a meal. Conversation was lively, filled with talk of cattle prices and the damage storms had done across the county. She kept to her work, serving food, listening from the edges. But then she heard one of the visitors laugh and say, "Strange how the owner here keeps himself hidden. You'd think a man with this much land would be easier to spot." The words struck her like a stone. She glanced toward the quiet cowboy, expecting him to look up, to laugh along, to act as puzzled as the others. But he didn't. He simply kept eating, his face calm, his eyes lowered to his plate. And in that silence, she felt the truth click into place. Her hands trembled as she carried a tray of bread back to the kitchen. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to assume too much. But the signs she had ignored now stood out clearly. The way the men listened to him. The way he worked harder than anyone, yet never asked for praise. The way he walked the land at night as though it belonged to him, because it did. She struggled to keep her breath steady, to move as though nothing had changed. But inside, her thoughts spun. She had been cooking for him all along. Not just another cowboy, but the man who owned the ranch, the land, perhaps even the lives of those who worked here. And he had chosen not to tell her. That night, after the visitors left and the men drifted to their bunks, she found herself alone in the kitchen, staring into the dying fire. Her heart pounded with questions she couldn't quiet. Why had he hidden it? Why live among them as if he were no different? And what did it mean for her, the woman who had come here with nothing but the hope of survival? She thought of every meal she had served him, every quiet glance exchanged across the table, every small kindness he had shown. All of it carried new weight now. He hadn't just been another ranch hand grateful for her food. He had been the one watching, measuring, perhaps testing her without her knowing. She pressed her hands against the wooden table, steadying herself. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows against the walls. Her world had shifted without warning, and nothing felt simple anymore. She had stepped onto this ranch believing she was just the cook. But now she knew her place in this story was far more tangled than she had ever imagined. The next morning felt different, though the ranch carried on as usual. The men rose at dawn, boots thudding against the floor, voices low and tired. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, frying bacon, pouring coffee, placing biscuits in the oven. But her thoughts weren't on the food. They circled back to him, the man she had mistaken for a cowboy like any other. Now every glance in his direction carried weight. Every word he spoke seemed layered with hidden meaning. He entered quietly, as he always did, shoulders broad, boots carrying the dust of the early morning. He didn't command the room with noise or presence, but still, the atmosphere shifted when he sat at the table. The others glanced his way before speaking, as though his silence gave permission. She had noticed it before, but now she understood why. He wasn't simply respected. He was the one who held everything together because the land belonged to him. As she placed a plate in front of him, her hand trembled slightly. He didn't look up, only murmured a soft "thank you," but she felt the weight of it more than ever. She wondered if he knew she had pieced the truth together. She wondered if he was waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. Not yet. The day passed slowly. She kept busy with chores, cleaning, preparing meals, and mending clothes, yet her mind kept drifting. She thought of the storm and the way he had led without boasting. She thought of the nights she had seen him walking the edge of the ranch, watching over them all. And she thought of how he had chosen to sit at the table like the rest, never once revealing what was his. It confused her, unsettled her, but also made her curious. Why would a man with such power hide it? That evening, when the men had gone to their bunks and the fire burned low, she found herself alone with him. He was at the table, sharpening a knife with slow, steady strokes. The scrape of steel against stone filled the silence. She hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing, but then she stepped forward. "You're not just one of them," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a long moment he said nothing. The knife rested in his hand, his expression unreadable. Finally he set it down and leaned back, his gaze steady. "You figured it out," her breath caught. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people act different when they know," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. "I wanted to see who you were, not who you thought you needed to be for the owner." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. "And what did you see?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his eyes searching her face as though measuring every line, every truth she carried. "I saw someone who doesn't quit," he said at last. "Someone who works harder than anyone gives her credit for. Someone who belongs here more than she realizes." The word struck her deeper than she expected. For years, she had been told she wasn't enough, that she had no worth beyond what others decided. And here was a man, one who could claim authority over her if he chose, telling her the opposite. It left her unsteady, unsure of what to say. "You watched me without saying a word," she whispered. "Do you know what that feels like? To think you're invisible, only to find out you were being tested all along." His brow furrowed. "It wasn't a test, not for you." "For me," she blinked. "For you," he nodded slowly. "I needed to know if I could trust the people around me. Men can lie when they want something from the boss, but when they think you're just another hand, they show their true selves. That's the only way I know who belongs here." She let the words sink in. It explained so much, yet still left questions lingering. Why her? Why had he let her stay when he could have dismissed her easily? She looked down, her chest tight, then back at him. And do I belong here? His eyes softened just enough to break through the hardness of his face. You've proved that a dozen times over. The fire cracked, filling the silence that stretched between them. She felt her heart beat faster, though she wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. For the first time, she didn't see him as just the quiet cowboy or even the owner of the land. She saw him as a man who had chosen to carry the weight of others, even when it meant hiding who he really was. Her mind spun with possibilities. What did this mean for her and her daughters, for the life she was trying to rebuild? Could this ranch be more than just a job, more than just a place to survive? She didn't have the answers, not yet, but she knew the truth had changed everything. The next morning, when the men filed into the kitchen for breakfast, she caught his eye across the table. He gave the same quiet nod he always did, but this time it carried new meaning. She wasn't just the cook anymore, and he wasn't just another cowboy. Something unspoken connected them now, something neither had put into words. The days ahead would bring more work, more storms, more whispers from the town that judged what it didn't understand. But as she watched him rise from the table, shoulders squared, gaze steady, she felt a flicker of strength she hadn't known in years. The land was his, yes, but in some way she couldn't yet explain, it felt like it was becoming hers too.